It may seem like a strange comparison to begin this video with. This is a video that's going to talk about fundamental principles of political science, fundamental questions of democracy, what democracy is, what democracy should be, how democracy functions in practice. And it's also going to talk about your life as an individual powerless person who cares about politics, what you can do. If, for example, you only have 5 friends on Facebook. I mean, I do not address most of my advice to a kind of Puff Daddy-esque multimillionaire cartoon. A Puff Daddy-esque multimillionaire tycoon. Tycoon and cartoon, obviously two linked concepts in my mind. Little slip there, but both are true of Puff Daddy. It has to be said. I would have a very different YouTube channel if I was presuming the average member of my audience had a lot in common with Puff Daddy. And it might be interesting to reflect on what options Puff Daddy has to change the world, Elon Musk has to change the world. But no, I like to think my average viewer has limited time, limited money, limited influence, limited power, and maybe a circle of just 5 friends that they can influence to a limited extent. And again, how are you going to be, to use Aristotle's fine phrase, how are you going to be a zoon politikon? What are you going to do in the next 5 years of your life? And what kind of person are you going to become? And what kind of society are we going to create betwixt and between the few thousand of us who see this video? Let me say, you can learn a lot from paying close attention to the incel political discourse, and you can learn nothing by ignoring it. And a crucial, fundamental, profound problem with the incels is that they don't know anybody. They don't know people face to face. And this is 2023. That problem, whether or not people are incels, the problem of not having face-to-face experience with people, that is at epidemic proportions, and it's only getting worse and worse and worse. Again, I can draw a whole bunch of examples from my life. When I was first in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, I was a white man who spoke English, to all appearances at least. People were actually very surprised when I could speak Thai, when I could speak Laotian, later when I could speak a little bit of Cambodian, this kind of thing. But people presumed English was the only language I could speak. And as I traveled around, people of all different ethnicities, all different nationalities, and speaking all different first languages would strike up conversation with me just to pass the time. And that was a big part of being a traveler or being a tourist. I'd be sitting by the banks of the Mekong River. And, sometimes the conversation would start with something very dull and prosaic, like asking about directions to see a certain museum. Oh, we've heard there's a museum here that deals with the history of opium, the opium trade. And I'd say, oh, yes, I've been there, but it's much further away than you think it is. And, you start just by talking about this kind of information. And then often you get into, why are you interested in the history of opium? Oh, I'm a political science major, and this is the research I'm doing. And, and now also you guys may know I had a scholarly background in Buddhism. So very often tourists would strike up conversation with me about they want to visit some ancient Buddhist temple. And it turns out I'm actually a scholar who reads the ancient language the Buddhist philosophy is written in, Pali and so on. Start having conversation with me. And you could feel it as the internet infested the cell phone, and the cell phone infested modern daily life. And everyone in these same locales, like sitting by the banks of the Mekong River, frankly, on either side, whether you're on the Laotian side or the Thai side of the Mekong River, people would come and sit down and look at their cell phone. People would come and sit down and open their laptop. And by the way, they did have cell phones before that. They did have laptops. They just weren't connected to the internet. And people didn't use the internet that way. People didn't rely on Google Maps that way. So, look, obviously there are negative aspects to the old system. I met and talked to a lot of racist people, just being real with you. And that was quite educational for me. Face-to-face meeting people with really strong racist beliefs. I learned something politically, just to give an example. Some people would find that so psychologically disturbing, they wouldn't want to deal with it. I met and talked to many homosexual people and many transgender people. Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, it's very open. I also met homophobic people. People were really reacting against that. They got there and they were not prepared for the levels of open homosexual and transgender culture. I got to see all this in a totally unplanned, disordered way. And today, you can make the same journey, you can take the same trip, and it's as if nobody speaks the same language as you. You're isolated, right, in exactly the same spaces that formerly were social and sociable. The only people who will talk to you will be people who come on the journey with you. It's kind of like going to a Canadian nightclub. I say this to Melissa all the time. If you walk past bars and nightclubs in Canada, if you go inside these places, the only people who will talk to you will be the group of friends you brought with you. That's what socializing is like in Canada. And, it's not like that, for example, in the United Kingdom. In England, people really go to a pub and talk to complete strangers. Anyway, so this is this big fundamental change in the world where, like, again, people say to incels, people say to internet addicts, people say to shut-ins, people say to video game players and Redditors or whatever, people will say, oh, you should go out. You should go outside. Doesn't matter if you go outside. The internet is, people carry the internet with them. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter. You can fly to Cambodia and be on the banks of the Mekong River. You can fly to Egypt and go see the pyramid. And everywhere you go, you're just as alone. And nobody talks to you, and you don't have a meaningful conversation with anyone else. Everyone is using Google Maps on their phone. Nobody is talking to a stranger and asking where something is and having an interesting conversation, right? You could go, again, sorry, I'll give a great example. I think everybody here has a gym membership. Who the fuck do you talk to at the gym? You know what I mean? Oh, pardon me. Can I get that over there? Oh, yeah, thanks. Like, you know what I mean? I'm not saying you say zero word. You don't have a conversation at the gym. You go to the gym alone. You work out there alone. You leave alone. Well, guess what? You can go to Egypt and see the pyramids alone. You can go to Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand and see some ancient Buddhist ruins. And, part of what interested me was the modern history. You can see the craters left behind by the Vietnam War. And today, you do all those things alone. So coming back to this little aperçu, this little glimpse into the incel subculture I'm just using to set up this conversation about democracy. You talk to these incels and you say to them, look, in real life, if you know people face to face in real life, they will say to you, for example, oh, Barbara, I only met Barbara because I was studying the history of ceramics and I took a pottery course. And she also took this course in pottery, and then we met and started talking because we were both interested in ceramics. That's real life. That's the way real people meet and fall in love. And the guy will tell you, and Barbara will tell you, they would have never found each other attractive, and they would have never started a conversation. They would have never fallen in love and had sex if they didn't happen to get an interest in ceramics. And and that's the fucking truth. Like, it really, the incels want to believe all these things. They construct these abstract notions in their mind, abstract chalkboard reasoning, as if, like the laws of physics, there are, these different numerical levels and a hierarchy to how attractive someone is. And no, Barbara met this guy and liked this guy because they both took a course on ceramics. And there's she wasn't evaluating, is this guy a 7? Is this guy an 8? Is this guy and he wasn't evaluating her that way either. They got interested. They made some kind of connection. They started being friends. They went out for coffee a couple times. And one thing leads to another and whatever. Now they're in love and they have kids. And if you know a lot of different couples, presumably it's not going to be ceramics and pottery again and again and again. It's not like, hey, guys, I discovered the hidden law of physics here. The hidden trick is learn pottery. No, it's a whole bunch of different answers. People develop different interests that bring them together, that create common ground, that introduce them to people, and they come together. So, like, this is the most obvious thing in the world. If you know people, if you have face-to-face, deep experience with people where you really know them and really trust them, and what will the incels say back to you? They will say, show me peer-reviewed quantitative data. Show me studies, show me evidence, show me proof. Right? And there's something very touching about that, right? So on the one hand, these are the people most disconnected from empirical experience, right? From real data, right? Real truth, real proof. But on the other hand, what their idea of proof, right, their idea of evidence is an academic paper that's gone out and interviewed people, that's compiled some data and is giving you percentages, right? That's their view of the world, and they're willing to shut out any evidence to the contrary. Now, you can even just think that through. How would you really, substantiate the claim that people meet each other and fall in love because they have something in common? They have something in common intellectually. Like, and this is not the most refined intellectual interest. They have something in common intellectually, like they decided to take pottery lessons. How am I going to prove this to you, that this is how human sexuality works? How you want proof? And at the same time, these guys will embrace a very abstract, very abstruse, very impossible to falsify theory out of evolutionary psychology. We're like, oh no, but when you think about it, cavemen over millions of years did pottery too. Cavemen over millions of years did basket weaving. Cavemen over millions of years did, handicrafts, macrame. Okay, millions of years of macrame. We're not really talking about anything philosophical here, but there is a kind of evidence base you build up from knowing people face to face in the real world, and that you can't build up in any other way. And what the incels show you is that now in the 21st century, increasingly, our discussions about politics have to be addressed to people who lack that experience, who lack that evidence base, and who are always going to lack it. And they are people who, yes, they're partly brainwashed by cellular phones, they're partly brainwashed by the internet, but to the greatest extent, they're brainwashed by formal education, right? The fundamental problem with incels is that they went to the same kind of school I went to. They went to the same kind of university. That's who taught them to do this. Who taught them to go and Google a topic and go to Wikipedia and look at the footnotes and say, where's the peer-reviewed paper that proves this? And they are out there finding peer-reviewed papers. They are cherry-picking that back up their worldview the same way neo-Nazis do, the same way communists do. Pretty much every fringe ideology has enough peer-reviewed literature to buttress their claims, no matter how implausible. Okay. I'm going to have a brief digression here and then come back to the topic in the title of the video. What I want to talk about is equality, and what equality means to us now and what it doesn't mean. Because equality has become one of the great ghosts that haunts political discourse. It's become this towering, terrifying abstraction on the chalkboard that all political ideals and aspirations must live up to. They must serve this abstract notion of equality, the same way that in a period of Christendom, of Christian-dominated politics, everything has to serve salvation. Everything has to serve the greater glory of God, has to serve the subjects of your kingdom going to heaven after they die rather than being led astray into hell. It's become a guiding ideology. And nowhere is this more obvious than, for example, in the discussion of the politics of education. Many people will tell you right away that the reason for education is equality. The reason for government involvement in education is equality, that the purpose of education is to create or sustain equality. I met face-to-face, okay, I'm going to try to anonymize this. This was a woman, this was before I was married. This was a woman I was talking to as a potential girlfriend, partner, wife. And she had experience as an English teacher. I also had experience as an English teacher, but for both of us, that wasn't our main career. It was a job we'd kind of done in between other things. And she was really unburdening to me how disturbed she was by the inequality of her students and her struggle to create equality in the classroom. And indeed, this is a dangerous term, but to create equality of outcomes. It's like she wants everyone in the class to get a B+ or something. And the reality was there's a certain number of students who are really talented and hardworking and advanced. And if she's taking the time to teach to the disadvantaged students, then those students are bored and they may actually get up and walk out. It's just cultural. Where you are, they may not, but they'll actually leave. They won't come back. They'll openly say this is at too low a level. Like, you're spending all your time talking to this moron in the corner, but I want to, I want us to. She was, and I'm giving her credit. She was intelligent enough and cared enough as a teacher. She was passionate about this. She really kind of didn't know how to cope with this, and she was very shocked by the nihilism of my answer. This is what I said verbatim. I can tell you exactly word for word what I said. We're sitting in a coffee shop at a coffee table, and I said to her, all of your students are unequal. They arrive in your classroom unequal, and they will depart from your classroom more unequal. The function of education is to exacerbate inequality. All education makes people more and more unequal. And as a general rule, to which there are a few exceptions, the students who come in smarter, harder working, better informed, more wise, what have you, the students who are advantaged, right, they will become even more advantaged through the education you can offer them. And the students who are disadvantaged will, in relative terms at least, fall further behind. And that is education in principle and in practice. If you want a society with maximum equality, you want a society with minimum education or no education at all. And again, so it's a brief statement. I said it in about that many words, but it really struck her like a thunderbolt. All education increases inequality. And she'd just been seeing this on a daily basis. She felt bad. The smart students are getting smarter and smarter, so to speak, and the dumb students are getting dumber and dumber. This is what she was seeing every day. And I remember she sat there and kind of stared into her cup of coffee or stared down the table. I remember her looking for a long while wordlessly. And she said, I guess I'm just really fucked up by this social message of no child left behind. And I remember I Googled it a few days after that. It wasn't the same day. My access to the internet was very limited. This relates to what I was saying about access to the internet through your cell phone and a laptop. I didn't have access to the internet every day. But a few days later, a week later, I remember I Googled the origin of that phrase, no child left behind. And it turned out it was a particular political slogan in the United States in a particular period. And it was, understandably, a call for better education for the poor and the disadvantaged. The idea of no child left behind. Now, this is such an important issue, but it is an issue on which both the left and the right are incoherent. And without digressing into too deep and long a philosophical lecture about incoherence, I just want to remind you, something can be true, something can be false. Something can be coherent and it can be incoherent. These are separate criteria. So, for example, you could have a Christian philosophy that's completely coherent, but it's false because God doesn't exist. God doesn't answer your prayers. We can get to other specifics of exactly what is false, but it can be coherent. And you can say, okay, this is a coherent religious worldview. It's a coherent philosophy of how to organize society and so on. It's coherent, but it's wrong and it's evil even, but that's coherent. When I'm saying that what the left wing has to say about equality is incoherent, this is not a claim about true and false, and it's not a claim about good and evil. And I think that many leftists, if you kind of push them on this and say, yeah, but what you're saying about equality here, it's not true. What they will retreat to is claiming that the world would be a better place if we all behaved as if it were true. Like they may admit that it's a fiction, but that it's a kind of beneficial fiction for us all to participate in. Like that, for example, it would be beneficial to organize an education system on the premise that everyone is equal. Okay. So I can give a million examples of this. So I've been in a classroom where girls, they were girls, not men, girls who had a Chinese mother and a white father and were raised speaking Chinese in the home by one parent were sitting and competing with me as equals in a Chinese 101 intro to Chinese class. I get there's kind of a weird aspect of racism here. I think those girls, I think if they had been 100% Chinese, if both parents had been Chinese, I think they wouldn't have been allowed in the class. And I don't even think it's a written rule. I think the professors would have just informally said, well, look, this class isn't really for people born and raised in China or something, or people who are Chinese. So it was specifically half Chinese. And I've been through this with half Japanese too. As it happens, I think every single one of those girls was a product of a white father with an Asian mother, not vice versa. That was the pattern being observed in this case. And, guess what? We're not equal. Like, I am at the most severe disadvantage imaginable compared to these girls who grew up with a Chinese mother speaking Chinese in front of them. Now, I imagine, for example, their Chinese mother, while cooking them dinner, might have the news on in Chinese and is talking to them about what's happening in the news and explaining. How is the class gonna work? Now, one class I was in, and I dropped this class, and I don't know what the fuck I don't know. After I dropped the class, I don't know how the professor coped with this. There were two elderly white people in the class. So again, most of the students are 19 or something, normal college age. But there were two elderly white people who had been Canadian government bureaucrats living in China. They were not quite ambassadors, but they were part of a Canadian government program, which I won't specify. And they were living in China and being paid taxpayers' money to be in China. They lived in Beijing for like 10 years on the Canadian government's dime, and they were now retired. They were past 65, and they decided to enroll in this university class, and they were incredibly disruptive to the rest of the classroom. It's just awful. And it's like, you have had the experience of 10 years. They were both white people living in China, and God, we can't study together. We can't do this. I can't do this exercise with you. I can't stand you interrupting the teacher. And I think this was literally the last day I was in the class. They would sit in the front row. I remember them interrupting the teacher to ask that the pinyin be removed from the lesson, to remove the phonetic notation so you just had Chinese characters. It was like, this was the level 2 class in Chinese. This was a class in Chinese for people who had only been studying Chinese for 3 months. The level 1 class was when you had 0 experience. And this is a level 2 class. And it's like, sorry, you think after 3 months, people don't need to see like the phonetic notation, like "tan"? They don't need to be reminded how to pronounce, like, So I'm just saying, there are all kinds of different situations. These are situations in which I'm the disadvantaged party. It's like, oh, really? So you would like to conduct this class with the fiction that we're all equal? You think that's effective? That's efficient? I want to put a very human face on this, this problem. Many of you guys can shout out if you've been in this situation or not. Have you ever had a job in which there is a guy, and you're not really sure if he's mentally disabled or if he's just very stupid, or maybe he has a combination of being stupid and an alcoholic or something. He's a very slow guy on the job, and everyone around him does more work than he does. Everyone kind of takes on more of what should be his responsibilities to help him out. And like, we're all getting paid the same amount of money, but it's like, oh yeah, that's Bob. Let's try to help out Bob. Let's, everyone is covering for him or helping him out. And there is no reason why. There's no conspiracy. No one's forcing you to do it. Everyone just knows, oh yeah, Bob is kind of slow. Let's help him out. And everyone just out of some kind of good-natured sense is like, oh yeah, even though I'm paid the same amount as Bob, I'm going to do part of his job for him. I'm going to take the weight. I'm going to carry the weight for Bob. Now, if you talk to people, I'm going to use one example from an actual job I had. If you talk to people doing that, some of them will have a specific reason. Some of them will say, I think if we help out Bob this way, he'll catch up. Like, he'll get better with time. He's going to be equal to the rest of us in future. And some people will say the opposite. They'll say, no, a guy like Bob is really born disadvantaged. He's never going to be able to he's never going to compete with us or be on the same level as us. And we just have to do our best to help him cope with this job. So I just say both perceptions, exist. I knew a kid, and I'll be honest with you, looking back, he seemed like a sweet kid. He seemed like a really nice kid in school. And he was very memorable to me because he was the only example of a kid I've ever seen, I've ever known in any capacity, who was raised by a single father. So the mother had disappeared, whatever the story was in this family. And I saw him with his father once, and not hating, but his father looked old enough to be his grandfather. And all I knew about this family was the father was a former military man. And obviously, he'd gotten with a much younger woman. Sheer speculation on my part, but it seemed like there's an older guy who got a younger woman pregnant. The younger woman didn't want to stick around. So he's raising this kid alone. And again, this is all just based on interpretation of appearances. I didn't pry, I didn't gossip, I didn't ask, but it was remarkable. There was this one kid at my school being raised by a single father, no mother, as opposed to the opposite, which is much more common. And this guy was ex-military, and he had obviously told his son from an early age, from the cradle, that his son doesn't have to worry about getting good grades in school because he could go into the military the same way his father did. And the kid, he had no friends. Nobody wanted to be anywhere near this kid, which is sad. But he had a kind of happy, carefree life and attitude towards school, I think precisely for that reason. He didn't feel he had to get an A+. He felt he could have a kind of reliable income in the military, just like his own father did. You know, and I've got to tell you, this kid was not mentally disabled at all. He was a normal kid of normal intelligence. Who knows what his upper levels of potential could be. He was not dumber than any other kid. All the teachers treated him like he was retarded. You could feel it, the lower expectations. They're like, oh, you know, that's Bobby. Bobby has no mom. Bobby is raised only by his father. And again, my ability to judge age, I was a kid also. I don't really know how his father looked like he was 60. I don't know. Like, oh, he's being raised by this old man who has no book learning. Oh, he's at such a disadvantage. You know, everyone treated him this way, you know. Now, just being real with you, if you guys don't know, I was raised in a bad home. I really was. And this kid, in a lot of ways, probably had advantages over me. He was probably raised in a better home than I was. I could digress, but you know, that's the way he was perceived. That's the way he was treated. You know, what does equality mean? You know, what does it mean to you? What does it mean in education? What does it mean in the workplace? Does it mean the teacher has and by the way, this kid was white. I mean, you know, who knows if he had been black or Hispanic or something, how he would, or some other ethnicity. I don't know. You know, does it mean the teacher being a harsh taskmaster and getting down your neck and saying, look, Bob, I don't care if you were born with one leg, and I don't care if you were born with one parent. I don't care what your fucking situation is. I don't care if your father told you you don't need to get an A+ because you can get into the army. You suck at math, and you got to buckle down and work 10 times as hard to catch up and be just as good at math as they are. What are the attitudes? What are these supposedly loving and kind and encouraging attitudes that that go along with this philosophy? Now, yeah, I was going to use an example in the workplace. Right. I knew a guy whose nickname was Audie. You can't make this stuff up. And, you know, originally his situation was, I think everyone was kind of supporting him and putting up with him with the understanding that he would get better and better. He would get sharper. He would figure out how to do the job. But he had been doing the job for about 10 years. And very understandably, you know, instead, he was regressing. He seemed more mentally disabled. He seemed more, to be frank, he seemed more mentally retarded with the passage of time. And I can think of different reasons for that. When I met the guy and I worked with the guy, I assumed he was a combination of an alcoholic and a drug addict. My boss, who was his boss also, insisted that no, that's not the case. It was just some kind of mental disability. And there were different reasons why he, as the employer, you know, over this guy's employer for like 10 years, would be in a position to know. Well, I'll give you an example. So this is in the book publishing industry. And obviously that's a great job for someone who cares about books, cares about the idea of, you know, the life of the mind, this kind of thing. And I remember one of the other employees being on the phone with the guy, He's in the warehouse. The warehouse hasn't changed in 10 years. Like this, literally, the same books are on the same shelf in the same locations in this warehouse over 10 years. When a new book is published, it's kind of added at the bottom right corner. But like nobody reorganizes this warehouse. So if a book was published 20 years ago, it's on the same shelf in the same place. You know what I mean? You can get familiar with this warehouse. And not to brag, someone at my level of intelligence within just a couple of days knows where everything is in the warehouse. But this guy's been working there for 10 years. And I saw this, another employee is on the phone. It's like, no, Audie, it's a blue book. Audie says back, there aren't any blue books. There are blue books. I'm looking, and the person on the phone has a photograph of the shelves of the warehouse. I'm looking at a photograph right now that I took the last time I was there because she knew she was getting the situation. The third shelf from the top on the left-hand side, it's a blue book. The first letter in the title is the letter A. Like she's not even trying to get this guy to read, like whatever his level. Like so, there's a capital letter A and it's blue. Third, and this goes on. This is yelling at this guy to try to get him to get the right book off the right shelf. And she says to my boss, "Look, this guy's not getting better. Like he seems to be regressing or becoming more disabled with time. This is the book industry. This is book publishing. Hopefully, you'd be with highly literate, highly motivated people." Now, there's more than one attitude you can have towards this. One attitude you could have is, not everybody's a genius. Maybe it's really important that we all learn to work together as unequals and that there's a job for Audie and that there's a job for me and we contribute to this book publishing enterprise on a whole different level and doing different kinds of things. But I just say, this is coming back to my parable of the incels. This is something you only learn from direct experience. If I didn't have the experience of, I've worked with mentally disabled people, I've worked with physically disabled people. Very briefly as a teacher, I've actually taught classes of mentally disabled children. It's very memorable. It wasn't very many hours, but I really remember it. And I've been in the workplace working with mentally disabled people. I'd like to say I have the experience of working with brilliant people or people more intelligent than myself. Really, I don't. Really, I don't. But, I do have the experience of being in a kind of workplace at Cambridge University, at Oxford University, at various universities. I'm being surrounded by people with PhDs while I have no PhD. I certainly have the experience of being in a professional context with highly qualified people who consider themselves brilliant. Just to give you an example, in Cambodia, I was conducting research and presenting findings to like a boardroom. And this guy would be the representative of the US government. This guy would be the representative of the European Union. There'd be these highly educated, highly credentialed people. And I'm presenting and defending. There would also be a representative of the government of Cambodia, for example. I was doing this. Hong Kong. I had board meetings in Hong Kong. I'm presenting research and findings to multimillionaires with all kinds of credentials and educational background. These people were not geniuses, just being real with you, but a lot of them thought they were. A lot of them thought of themselves as so I've been in kind of competitive, high level workplace situations too. And I'll always remember I knew very briefly, I knew a woman and she had worked in the Prime Minister's office in Australia. And the particular prime minister at the time was committed to employing mentally retarded people in his office for political reasons. And she just described the horror of having to rely on someone who's mentally retarded to do photocopies when the photocopies really matter. Like, this is for a briefing with, whatever, the prime minister of China attending or something. Like, this has got to be perfect and it's got to be done now. And how are we going to cope with someone who's really mentally incapacitated being given this responsibility? So the point is, you might think it's nothing to trust someone with doing photocopies. Did he photocopy the right things? Are the pages in the right order? Is it all there? And no, you got to spend more time double checking and triple checking his work and correcting the mistakes he made than if you had done the photocopies yourself. And it's horrible. It's very hard to work with. Okay. My warning is, on the one hand, we're in an historical transition from the significance that equality had about 300 years ago to the significance it has today. And I'll talk more about that. And then on the other hand, we're in this transition from a world in which people had direct hands-on experience, face-to-face experience with their fellow human beings, to a world where everyone is a fucking incel, in the sense that everyone's experience is, on the one hand, through internet forums, YouTube, Reddit, this kind of, self-selected world of phony reinforced opinion. They don't have a lot of experience dealing with people face-to-face with real experience. And then on the other hand, of course, it's their experiences through formal education. They know things like how to look up a peer-reviewed study, how to find a PDF from a peer-reviewed journal, and to quote that to buttress and reinforce their worldview. That's what they learned in formal education. But they are really lacking this. They're really lacking a kind of informed skepticism based on real life experience, real empirical experience, real political experience, so on and so forth. I said this actually recently to my property manager here. I could say my landlord, but he's not really my landlord. Um, the rights of man came up, equal rights for man. And I just said to him, so I know the guy. The guy has a university degree in political science also, and now he's working as a property manager on this building. I said to him, oh yeah, the truth is, human rights as a doctrine was invented to justify the rebellion of the American people against the King of England. That's what it was. And that's what it is. And that's always what it's going to be. And in saying that, we're cutting right to the heart of, we're cutting the Gordian knot, so to speak. We're breaking through all of the paradoxes that seem to be contained in an argument about human equality. It is strangely sleepwalking through and unaware of the inequality of women versus men, the inequality of indigenous people versus European colonists, settlers, the inequality of black versus white, of the slave versus the slave owner, right? And that is because, very fundamentally, that is not what equality was about. That was not what it meant at all. It's not even a fiction or a lie. It's a very strange kind of anachronistic misinterpretation of the meaning of the words. And I would just point out, in case you have forgotten, the American Revolution happens before the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, they're never really quite at peace with what the meaning of the rights of man is and what it entails. The French Revolution is, there are several steps to this, but the French Revolution is taking propaganda from the American Revolution and repurposing it and repackaging it to suit the short-term interests of the French Revolution. And a lot of it doesn't really make sense. Now, the rights of man within France, again, nobody seems to see a problem with men versus women. The French Empire in this period extends far beyond France. It includes far-off places like Cambodia to some extent, so on. But above all, it includes Haiti, right? Haiti and the Caribbean. The rights of colonized and conquered people, as opposed to citizens in the metropole, is this equality, right? Black versus white, free versus slave. And anyone today looks back at this and says, were these people all psychopaths? Were they all illiterate in their own first language? How is it possible that there is this discourse about human rights, the rights of man, about equality? And the word equality is there again and again and again and again, right? And yet there's no interest, there's no understanding of equality in our sense today, which is precisely obsessed with the question of men and women being equal, black and white being equal, so on and so forth. How is it possible? Well, I'll tell you exactly how it's possible. In the English Civil War, the question was, if the king is guilty of treason, should he have his head cut off like any other man? That's what equality meant. Period. And in case you don't know, in the English Civil War, they literally decapitated the king. And this is a kind of shock and trauma that, no offense, none of you can imagine today. None of you have lived through anything like that. And, it takes some imagination. Right now in Myanmar, what do you think is going to happen next in Burmese politics. Still, that nobody has decapitated Aung San Suu Kyi. I'm just pointing out, it's not impossible. Doesn't seem to be the way the junta is playing the game. I think, again, you cannot imagine the kind of grief and shock and horror that would come about by her decapitation. Again, we get to the recent history of Cambodia. We can find other examples of really extreme political changes and those sort of things. And just in as much as the king was a personality, everyone knew he was the main personality in politics throughout everyone's lifetime. Even if they hated the king, they had been reading newspapers criticizing the king in England for all those years. And now the king is dead. He was laid low. He was dragged into court and put on trial like any other commoner. And when he was found guilty, he was killed. That's equality. That is the equality that our whole system of laws, constitutions, political science is based on. And it has nothing to do with Navajo people being equal to white people. Like, I wish it did. I actually care about Navajo people. I actually care about Cree people and Ojibwe people and Indigenous. I actually care about that shit. Most of you don't, no offense. I care about people in Myanmar and Cambodia. These are the political things that have consumed my life. Have turned me into an old man. I care about all this shit. Even the status of people from China and India within the British Empire, right? But the status of people from China and India in China and in India within the British, it's crazy. What about the indigenous people of Australia in Australia? What if they get on a boat and come to England? What does equality mean? That was not the meaning of equality. And in an important sense, it still is not the meaning of equality. Okay, now flash forward. The American Revolution, it is a complete repetition of the use of equality in this sense, although they do not kill the King of England. The King of England remains in England. It is an outright rebellion against the King of England. And again, no offense, it is very difficult for any of you to imagine what it would have been like to live in New York City at that time and to have a war that truly turns brother against brother, where people dug trenches in the streets of New York and fought block by block, trench by trench. And this included black people murdering white people and freeing their slaves, and the slaves coming to fight with the other black slaves. You can imagine the terror white slave owners were in that situation, because they knew this was a possibility it was actually happening. But also, the two sides were not very well defined. Who is a Tory? Who will be killed for being a Tory? And the Sons of Freedom, the Sons of Liberty, the anti-Tory side, they were desperate for money. They were very, very motivated to label someone a Tory and kill them, if not kill them, throw them in prison, so that they could take all their property, so they could take their money and directly use it to fund the war effort, the ongoing Civil War. Street by street, block by block, brother against brother. Literally, families were divided. Governor Morris, an historical figure I like to talk about as an example, he was turned against his own mother, and it was something like there were 3 or 4 brothers around, and the brothers were divided. Some brothers were on this side, and that's how it was. And people, there's another example I was reading where a guy who was turned against his own university professor. His own university professor ended up having to run away back to England because he didn't support the revolution, and his student did. And you have some written correspondence back and forth between student and professor. They'd gone through law school together, or what have you. This is a very intimate face-to-face. It was a blood feud, that tore people apart. And again, I just want to emphasize, still today, the meaning of the word Tory, right? It's very hard to pin down. But simply to be called a Tory was a death sentence. And it was certainly enough for a writ of attainder, which is, say, for all your property to be stolen from you. So this is a really nasty, really brutal war that did involve torture and did involve interrogation, did involve execution, and did involve the question of, will you be loyal to a king who you were willing to fight and die for and who was supporting you right up until the day before yesterday, when you were in a state of constant war with the French? And remember, the French are right there in Quebec. You had constant war between the English and the French. The King of England has been supporting you as an American in your fighting against French, and against the Spanish, who are surrounding you on all other sides, basically, in that period. You've been in a state of constant war against the French and the Spanish, supported by the King of England and fighting for the King of England. And now, all of a sudden, these rebels say, we're switching sides. Now we're fighting with the French. Now we're fighting with the Spanish. Now they're our allies. Now you're receiving guns and money from the French and the Spanish, your former hated enemies, just a couple of months ago, to fight against the King of England. Why? Equality, the rights of man, and this very palpable political tradition going back to the English Civil War. What happened in the English Civil War as prefiguring the American Revolution. Okay. Now, I can only say a few words. The situation in France is much simpler because the situation in France was identical to the English Civil War, and everyone involved knew it, including the King of France. The parallelism with what happened in the English Civil War, the French Revolution, everyone talked about openly. It wasn't subtext, and the King of France himself knew it and talked about it and predicted that that was how his own situation was going to end. The King of France ultimately is put on trial for treason. It's decided long before that trial that yes, this doctrine of equality would be espoused. So I just mentioned one of the changes that happens is that the King of France has his title changed to being the King of the French. You can look into the exact nomenclature in French, but this makes it clear that it is not that the King of France owns the land, but that he is merely the first among equals. He is the leader of the French people. But you know what I mean? It may seem like a ridiculous distinction, but this was the kind of desacralization of the King of France. It's not that the King of France is our landlord and we're serfs or slaves working for him because he owns the land. No, he is, like in the same sense that someone is the president of the American people, he's merely the king of the French people. And whether or not he knew it, this was for him the first step towards the gallows. It was the first step towards the guillotine. It was the first step towards his own decapitation and death. Because once he was on our level, he was guilty of treason the same as anyone else, and he was killed the same as anyone else. Okay, so we have two big transitions here from that 18th century meaning of equality to the 21st century meaning of equality. Right, this is one big transition. And then the other transition, what I'm kind of calling the incel transition, the transition from being a society of people who we really know each other face to face. We understand what equality means in the workplace and in education, and so we understand the struggle to treat people as equals, to being a society of people who are addicted to mobile phone-based communication, internet, laptop-based communication, and then who think in terms of abstract principles written on a chalkboard. And as I've already said, in the current historical period, equality reigns over us like the Judeo-Christian God as this sort of prerequisite standard, the presumed purpose, the distinction more fundamental than the distinction between good and evil for any valid policy, any valid government program. It all must be in the service of this equality. This great that's apparently what we live for. That's apparently what we have a government for. What we have a society for, what we have democracy for, is to serve this notion of equality. And again, juxtaposed to that is the brutal reality of what inequality is and what inequality forever must be. Any questions? I'll take a pause right now. I admit I was cold when this began, but I might have to take off some layers here. Babe, you actually look like you've got sweat. But I mean, I have difficulty reading the expression on Melissa's face.
So I have democracy.
Right. So the title of this video is "Politics is not about equality. Democracy is not about equality." Melissa is asking the question, how do you have democracy with this inequality? I will come back to that. And I think that's ultimately the point of the conclusion. But let me ask you the opposite question. How would you have democracy with equality? I would claim that's what's impossible. Now, likewise, so let's just come back to the example of the Chinese language classroom. If we acknowledge the inequality of the classroom, then now we can teach Chinese. Now we can study Chinese. Now we can all learn Chinese together. We say, okay, look, Mei, you're half Chinese. Your mom was Chinese, so you can't be in the same classroom. Or it's another possibility. Mei, if you are going to be in the classroom, we're going to make you like a teaching assistant. You're not going to sit with the other students. You're going to sit up here next to the professor in a special seat. And maybe, you're going to help write things on the chalkboard. You're like, maybe you can be in the classroom, but with a special status, because you're not equal, Mei. Mei, you grew up speaking Chinese. You can't just be another student. So again, and I've alluded to some things. If you recognize the inequality, then we can have a Chinese language course. We can all learn Chinese together as unequals. My question is, when you want to believe in the illusion of equality, that's what makes it impossible and impractical. It makes it so awkward and difficult. In a parallel sense, I want to lean on this problem and say, okay, how do you have democracy if you are pretending everyone is equal? In real life, I had the experience of going to a left-wing political event in Toronto. And this was one of many events where I sit there and I realize I am really not left-wing at all. Ooh, I'm really disgusted by these people. It's a long time ago in Toronto, And I certainly thought of myself as left of center at the time. And you're like, ugh. Okay. And this conference was based on the principle that everyone has the equal right to speak and be heard. Now, already, of course, it's not true, because I show up at the conference. Some people are in the audience lining up for their 5 minutes at the microphone Q&A. And as I recall, it was 5 minutes. If you lined up and stood at the phone in the Q&A, there was a clock. You were given 5 minutes. And 5 minutes can feel like a long time. Okay, and so in theory, a Nazi can get up on the microphone. Right? Anyone, right? Equality. Okay. But already there's an inequality because some people are on stage answering the questions and some people are in the audience. This is a very fundamental inequality. And that is dealt with in depth in chapter 2 of this book. I got fan mail about chapter 2. It's a very, very important thing. You go to a vegan conference, vegan political event, why are some people in the audience and some people are on stage? And very often the people on stage are less knowledgeable than the people in the audience. But sometimes people are on stage because they're physically attractive, because they're a sexy Instagram influencer. And that there are a lot of people in the audience to be better on stage than that. How someone is selected to be on stage, who gets to speak, who gets to be silent. Okay, but we counterpose to this the idealistic notion of equality, that we're all equal, everyone has an equal right to talk. This is just an event. This is just an event where literally they put up posters and said anyone can come. I've been to a lot of city hall events like that too. Okay, so what actually happens in practice? A particular faction of communists. There were many communists at this event, and the communists are especially motivated to get up and speak. It was specifically the Trotskyites. Trotskyites are a form of communists who are despised by all the other communists. The Trotskyites went up with a prepared statement, written and printed out on a piece of paper, and stood up and spent their 5 minutes reading this statement off the page. And then the person said, your 5 minutes are up. And they went and sat down, and the next person came with the microphone and continued reading the statement. So it became a 20-minute lecture from the Trotskyites. And I remember there was a guy, I think he was like the fourth of the four. Like, you have 5 minutes in a row, 5 minutes. It's a long time. You're sitting there. Oh my God. Listening to these fucking communist, extremist maniacs making their fucking statement, which of course it's just in no way interesting. But anyway, I think the fourth guy came up. He was a skinny, somewhat effeminate gay man who was also a communist Trotsky, and he's reading it. And when he starts reading from the paper, if there's a visible groan from the audience, and many of the people in the audience are communists or far left wingers, not me. Oh, this again. And I remember this guy, he was just a little bit more sensitive than the other kind of cult members who were in his group. And he said, look, everyone's supposed to be equal. You gave these liberals their time and you gave this person everyone's supposed to get similar. Why can't we also have our 5 minutes of time? Okay, you think you want to have an open mic where it's equal time for the Holocaust deniers, equal time for the Nazis. Is that how equality works? Is that how democracy works? Now, conversely, this is not my situation, but this could have been my situation. Let's say you are a white man who has lived in Myanmar, worked in Myanmar, learned the Burmese language. You really understand the politics, not just as a drawing on a chalkboard. You understand the real life reality of how politics in Myanmar works. And you say, why the fuck don't I have a voice in Canadian Parliament? Canada is not that big a country. It is certainly a country with an appallingly low level of education, an appallingly low level of political sophistication. You are in the position of saying, I have a better informed opinion. I have a more sophisticated perspective on what's happening in Myanmar than any of the people who are elected as members of parliament, the equivalent of members of Congress in the States. The people who happen to have won elections, none of them campaigned on the basis of their expertise in Myanmar. None of these people in government, whether it's the prime minister or the queen or whatever, none of you know shit about Myanmar compared to me. I want my time on the microphone. Because when I see you fucks debating politics of Myanmar, which happens in the Parliament of Canada, it happens in the American House of Congress and the American Senate, everyone gets up to front like they know what the fuck they're talking about Myanmar. And I know more than you. Partly book learning, partly knowing the language, the history, the politics. And then you have to live with the frustration that you don't have 5 minutes on the microphone. You don't have 15 minutes. You don't have 45 minutes. You have no voice in this so-called democracy, whereas someone else does. J.J. McCullough spoke in front of Parliament twice recently. Well, not me. I wasn't invited to speak in front of. So on this particular political issue, I'm just being real. On any particular issue, do you really think I know less than J.J. McCullough? I would actually, let's invite J.J. McCullough to a challenge. I do not think there is any political issue on this earth on which my opinion matters less than J.J. McCullough. J.J. and I have talked. He's about 10 years younger than me. He could catch up. I doubt it. But to be fair, J.J. is a younger man. But whether it's Myanmar or the future of democracy, anything else, right? So there's a question there. And it's a question that for the most part goes unasked and unanswered, just even in terms of who gets to speak and who must sit and remain silent. So that's true at a vegan conference. I had this particular experience at a left-wing political event in Toronto. You know, it's true at Parliament. It's true in the Senate. It's true in Congress. It's true in the secret halls of power where people are making decisions about the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, right now, making decisions about what the CIA is really doing in Myanmar, what the CIA is really doing in Pakistan, which I'd be very interested to know. But those decisions are made in secret and in an opaque and non-democratic way. And what if you are the guy? I mean, again, the country the size of Canada, there's probably just one guy who knows anything about Myanmar and who is not a communist and not a Nazi and not some kind of crazy fringe figure. You know, in the United States, it's a bigger country. Maybe there are 10 guys, more likely 5. There may be 5 guys in the States who have a really informed and sophisticated opinion matters, and they can't get in. They can't get on the market. They can't be in that conversation discussion. Now, look, I just say briefly, this applies to many, many things. We hear now a lot of controversies about public transportation. There are a lot of left-wing nutcases who talk about public transportation, housing, sewage systems, ecology. How many people really have the level of expertise to talk about subways, trains, public non-for-profit public non-for-profit transportation? It's not meant to make a profit. It's meant to just make the city a better place to live. Elon Musk is the most influential person on this topic in the United States of America. He's not even an American citizen. I hate to tell you this. He doesn't travel by public transportation. Elon Musk does not take the bus. He doesn't take the subway. He has no education, so he knows fucking nothing. Everyone in the elite levels of American government, they're all listening to Elon Musk. Oh, how should we design and build public transportation for the city of Las Vegas, for example? Oh, Elon Musk. It's possible there's someone in my audience right now who has a humble, master's degree in public transportation or in something like urban planning with the focus being on public. There are people who know more than you want. You can't get in. You can't get on the microphone. All right. So again, totally good question. I will come back to it. How do you have democracy, without equality? how do you have democracy with equality? So I have a very stupid question from Jap in the audience. I assume this name is actually pronounced Yap. Looks like a South African name to me, but I don't know. Yap, I'm not disturbed by this question, but why don't you just search within my YouTube channel? Being real with you, it's possible you don't know that you can. Some people genuinely don't know that you can search past videos and you can search playlists. YouTube is not the best website for these. Oh, there's another guess, is that it's Hungarian. Well, looks like Afrikaner to me. You may genuinely not know that. I set up a separate website. I did not do the hard work. I asked a computer programmer to do this and set up this website that gives you a more easily searchable list of my past videos. Goes up to July of 2022 for whatever reason. But there's a long, very passionate video that I made while I was in Thailand to have my day in court the last time. If that's what you want to know, I don't really know what more I can do for you. But again, it may be a completely sincere question from someone who literally doesn't know how to search YouTube for the answer to that question. YouTube is genuinely not as easy to search as Google itself or something. But often for me too, I don't really use Facebook at all anymore. I don't. But I remember someone would tell you, "Oh, there's a discussion about this in a Facebook group," and the only way to find it was to sit there and scroll or something. Like, can you actually search in the Facebook group? So some of these websites are not as easy to kind of search as an archive as others. But yeah, everything about that topic, everything about the court case in Thailand that could possibly be said has already been said. So there's my answer to you. I would also say, do you support me on Patreon? Like, there are a lot of ways to talk to me. There's a lot of ways to ask that question. And I wouldn't be offended if I got that as a question within Patreon or as an email. But anyway, you've chosen to ask that off topic in the middle of this live stream, and there is your answer. I really don't think any of my regular viewers are asking for, say, another 2-hour live stream rehearsing and catching you up on the details of the court case, because they've all heard many hours on that topic over the years. Whereas I just want to say, before making this video, I looked back at when was the last time I talked about the riddle of equality, so to speak. It was 2016. So by the way, guys, 24 people in the audience. We should have more than 24 thumbs up. Hit the thumbs up button if you have a second. But if anyone has an intelligent question, I am going to see it. I am going to read it. Whatever. So if you don't have anything intelligent to say, I understand why you're intimidated. I understand why you're remaining. Your intimidation is completely understandable. Now, I want to digress for just a second on the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes is the author of Leviathan, and I do not think Hobbes is a brilliant or even interesting political philosopher. And I would go so far as to question why Hobbes is considered an important philosopher. The construction of genius, the construction of importance in the writing of history. How is it exactly particular literary figures are selected to represent the century they lived in? This is a very sort of factitious thing. This is particular people with particular theories and particular agendas construct the narrative of how political philosophy is remembered, and also how something like the study of literature, is remembered. I think the main reason why anyone knows the name Thomas Hobbes today is simply because he was British and wrote in English. I will ask you a very simple question. Who is more important for the history of the American Revolution? Machiavelli or Thomas Hobbes? There's absolutely no question Machiavelli is more important. And Machiavelli isn't merely twice as important as Thomas Hobbes. He isn't merely 10 times as important. He's 100 times as important. He's 1,000 times as important. And throughout the writing of the founding fathers themselves and the debates in the drafting of the Constitution, you all the time see allusions to and quotations from and discussions of Machiavelli. His name is almost never Machiavelli. It's always Machiavel, or it's spelled in different creative ways. But this is specifically the discourses by Machiavelli, not The Prince. The book he's famous for today is The Prince, but at that time it was a book called Discourses on Livy by Machiavelli was of tremendous political importance during those centuries, and Hobbes was not. And I would say that Hobbes still is not. Okay, nevertheless, through whatever sort of strange, uh, how important really are the Bronte sisters? I think there is a kind of conspiracy to convince you that Charlotte Bronte is an author of tremendous importance, and really she's not. This is my general approach to this. And I think you can look into the sort of historiography of how these things came to be unquestioned and presumed. How is it exactly that Immanuel Kant came to be seen as such an important philosopher? And there are alternatives. There are other readings of history that really Immanuel Kant was not one of the most important or influential people alive in the century. I will say this further. There is a theory, let's propose a theory right now, that Immanuel Kant did not have a single original idea of any interest or significance. I would be willing to say that about Thomas Hobbes, that Hobbes did not have a single original idea of any importance or significance. Okay. But what is interesting about Hobbes today, what gives him a kind of lively contemporary significance, is that he's willing to say to you, all this talk about freedom, it's just bullshit, isn't it? When you really think about the meaning of the word freedom, and this is from memory, but it's a pretty close paraphrase of what he says in Leviathan. It's like, when the French want to conquer a neighboring territory, they say they want to liberate it. They say they want to give these people freedom, but all they mean is we want them to be part of France, to be part of the French Empire, as opposed to the territory being ruled by the Austrians, the Italians, whoever the dispute is with, the Spanish. All these borders had centuries of, the idea of liberating a territory by conquering it just means incorporating it into your own domain, into your own empire. It doesn't really mean the people will be any more free, And even if it happens that they'll have more freedom as part of your empire than as part of the rival empire, really, this is all that we mean when talking about freedom is us versus them. So, this is a kind of nihilism that's present in his work. I would not say Hobbes was a nihilist, by the way, but he has this kind of relaxed, this is all bullshit, isn't it, attitude towards what could be properly called sacred concepts in political philosophy. And I do think, again, this book takes on the concept of compassion. It takes on also the concept of even intelligence. What do we mean when we say that, vegans are more compassionate than other people, or vegans are more intelligent than other people? And obviously, no spoilers here for the book. It's a complex and profound argument. But you know what? Catholics think that they're more compassionate than Protestants. Catholics think that they're more compassionate than atheists. You will not be surprised to find that pretty much all religious people of all religious traditions consider themselves more compassionate, more intelligent, more wise than atheists, or than, how do you think Hindus feel about Buddhists? How do you think Buddhists feel about Hindus? Who is the more compassionate? This is not a, philosophically real concept. There's something similar there on a deep level, to Hobbes being willing to say, look, this stuff about freedom, it's just us versus them. You could say, hey, the way this guy is talking about compassion, he's reducing it to an us versus them kind of contest in the same way. Do you believe that the United States now, or the United States ever in the last 300 years, has been an empire of equality? That it has brought equality to people by conquering them, by annexing their territory? Is that the significance of the United States of America? American politics, the American political system, democracy, does it exist for equality? Is it even about equality? Now, again, I'm actually politically very pro-American, by the way. It comes up in some contexts and not others, and that's a lot of people perceive me as right-wing for that reason. If you were an indigenous person living in the Great Desert, living in, you were a Navajo Indian or something, living in the century when the American Empire was moving west step by step, and when the Spanish Empire and Mexico were receding step by step, did you think, wow, it's really great that we're being annexed by the Americans, by Washington, D.C., that we're being incorporated into this other empire because now we have equality? And, you can look at New Mexico this way in terms of states that joined the Union quite late. You can look at the annexation of New Mexico, of California, of Alaska, of Hawaii. If you were an indigenous person of Hawaii, are you in a position to say, gee, before we didn't have equality, and now we do, thanks to the expansion of the American Empire? Now, obviously, I am not suggesting to you that these people did have equality when they were perhaps just ruled by a local tribal government, when the only government they knew may have been their own tribe or community. Or, on a case-by-case basis different. Or when the government they knew was the Mexican Empire, for example, that, the Mexican Empire, it was a very distant, hands-off government. If you'd been living in what later became New Mexico, your community probably did not get one piece of paper from Seville in a year. You had very, very little contact with government back in Spain of any kind. It was pretty close to anarchy, you could say. But, when the main contact you had was with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was out there converting you. That was your main contact with Spanish civilization and Spanish government. I'm not glorifying some kind of equality that existed beforehand. I'm questioning what was the transition. Now, conversely, here we are in the year 2023, and with absolutely no irony, Barack Obama justified the war in Afghanistan as bringing equality to the Afghan people. And the main form of equality that was talked about, interestingly, for a president of the United States who was himself half black, half white, was not racial and was not religious. It was not in terms of sectarianism. It was gender. Was to say, before Afghanistan was conquered by the Americans, there was no equality between men and women, and now there is some. Now there's more equality. And what was going on in Iraq during the Obama years, which is not quite as simple as a conquest. For example, the war against ISIS, very much actively propagandized in terms of being a war for equality against inequality. And you tell me how that worked out. In 2023, we can ask, how did that end? And, just as I said before, with kind of withering contempt, we can't look at the westward expansion of the United States as an expansion of the domain of equality. The people of California did not become more, the people of Florida, did not become more. Ooh, talk about a horrifying history. Whether you're talking about the indigenous people of Florida or the black people of Florida, or just the Latino people of Florida, Hispanic people of Florida. When the United States of America took over Florida, that was not a step forward for equality. Whoa, is that ever a chilling, horrifying chapter of history? That is not what American politics have ever been about. But obviously, here we are in 2023. When you're talking about Saudi Arabia, America's number one strategic ally, or you're talking about the Taliban, America's number one enemy, in either case, sure, of course, there's a contrast to be made in terms of equality and inequality. If you were looking at during the French Revolution period, say in the 18th century, if you're looking at the Ottoman Empire, this is Muslim empire adjacent to Europe and impinging into Europe, of course, you can contrast the liberty and the equality people have in France to the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so for some reason, I've invited intelligent questions from the audience, and I'm not looking at a whole lot, guys. I don't know. Melissa, you want? Go on.
Elon Musk example.
Right.
Do we have democracy? Do we have an aristocracy? Do we have rule of the wealthy, or do we have rule of even in your
Right.
discussion with J.J. McCullough,
Right.
you not being able to say that, well, these are aristocrats in office.
I'm going to summarize what Melissa says, but if Melissa wants to disagree or say further, she can. So this is about the question of simply who has a voice, whereas who is mute and stands silent. And she was raising again this issue of Elon Musk. Elon Musk has a voice in government. J.J. McCullough has a voice in government, right? They are heard, right? And is this a kind of aristocracy? Of course it is. Is this a kind of oligarchy? Is this corrupt? Is this about money? And it's not just money and wealth and fame. J.J. McCullough's the case. It's fame, not money, or not purely or primarily money. But there's probably some. I think there is some money involved, to be honest. Whether it's your ability to raise donations or what have you, a lot of this comes down. But yeah, that's talking about the extent to which politics is an aristocracy, just in the distinction between who has a voice and who is voiceless. What about the people who actually make the decisions? Now it gets even more stark and even more extreme. So I think a great example right now is cryptocurrency. It is certainly very interesting who has a voice in the cryptocurrency debate. I've been joking with Melissa lately, showing her photos of some of these crypto influencers. And again, some of these people have literally spoken in Congress, including infamously Sam Bankman-Fried. And there's a remarkable pattern. They are either women who look like supermodels and present themselves as supermodels, women who are in very good physical shape and very beautiful with all their hair and makeup done, and but who mysteriously do not have a university degree in economics, do not have a background showing any interest in economics or politics or anything else. So in several cases, I've sent Melissa a photograph of one of these people, and then you just Google and see what was her major in university, if she went to university at all. How do you suppose this woman, for whatever reason, just the pulchritude, just the physical beauty of these women gives them a voice? And again, to some extent, fame, to some extent, wealth. But it's fame and wealth that's a result of their physical beauty, nothing else. And with the men are presentable. It's not so much that they're handsome. It's not so much that they're gorgeous. But these are men who hold up and show off a $10,000 watch. These are men who show off that they drive a Ferrari or they drive a Lamborghini. They're often men who show off how beautiful their wife or girlfriend is while leaning on the Lamborghini and while showing off their watch. So with the men, there may be some men who are in this circle of influential people because they're handsome. But I'm being honest with you, in most cases, the men are just presentable looking. But instead of showing off their pulchritude, they are showing off their status as aristocrats, in short. It's that they have somehow become tremendously wealthy. And of course, in most of these cases, you can Google around and find out they didn't even become wealthy through their expertise in crypto. Maybe in a couple cases, that's true. And I was laughing about this with Melissa just the other day, because one of these guys, he was showing off. He was like, "Oh yeah, I bought this watch for $10,000 and this watch for $50,000. This pair of shoes cost $1,100. This pair of shoes cost $9." I said to Melissa, people who are actually wealthy don't remember how much each pair of shoe costs. They just don't. People who are actually wealthy do not wear a T-shirt that says Givenchy while showing off that they own a watch by Givenchy or whatever. That's not how actually wealthy people live or think. An actually rich person, if you ask them how much their shoes cost, they don't know. They never knew. They never even looked at the price. Those are what really rich people are like. Anyway, so there's this kind of strange world. So, who has a voice and who is voiceless? But then beyond that, who actually makes the decisions? And when you take that step, it becomes really terrifying to behold what a hopelessly corrupt aristocracy we're living in. I was alive during the Clinton administration. Were you alive? Melissa's considerably younger than myself. It's only the right wing who points this out. The left wing should care about it more than the right wing. The decision to normalize trade relations with communist China. The term used at the time was PNTR. So PNTR, if you don't know that term, you should look it up. It has a convoluted history. Permanent normal trade relations. But this was basically like a free trade agreement with China. It's not technically from, anyway. This decision had immediate disastrous consequences for every industry in the United States of America, including car manufacturing in Detroit. We're still dealing with it today in terms of electronics and computers. This relocated a huge percentage of all the world's manufacturing to communist China. And it did so with no promise from China that they would make a transition to democracy or anything else. So in terms of carrot and stick, this was giving the carrot and throwing away the stick, and it massively reduced the economic power of the United States of America and ruined the quality of life for people in the United States of America, especially in places like Ohio and Michigan, the so-called Rust Belt states. Now, do you think that decision was made democratically? Both the free trade agreement with Mexico and the sort of de facto free trade agreement with China, which is technically PNTR, it's not technically a trade agreement, but allowing China to have the trade status it had from Clinton forward. There is absolutely no way 51% of Americans would have voted for that. And sometimes you have to add a footnote, like if Americans understood what it meant, there's no way. No, in this case, it doesn't even matter how ignorant the American people were. There is no way they would have granted this to communist China. There's no way they would have granted this to Mexico. These were anti-democratic decisions. And as I mentioned, we have someone in Detroit writing in. Hey, Emma. So Melissa's from the greater Detroit area. We were in Detroit, a couple months ago. We were seeing the reality of it downtown. Anyway, even if you imagine the American people, the American electorate as this ignorant mob who don't understand the finer points of international investment finance, there's absolutely no way. But then look at who made the decision. Yeah, one question is who had a voice, which is a good question. Who made the decision? And it turns out it's a small number of people within the Democrat Party who made a lot of money from their investments in China. Now, who criticizes the Democrat Party for this? Right-wing libertarian Republicans. Like, that's the joke. It's the people who believe that's cool and fair, like anarcho-capitalists and right-wingers. They think it's totally fine for people, they support right-wingers in the American Republican Party who are exactly that kind of wheeler-dealer making money out of this shit. It's not actually people who are opposed to that morally in principle. It should be the left who's pointing at that. It should be people like Bernie Sanders who are pointing at that and saying, look, this free trade agreement with China was a disastrous decision for America in every way, not just quality of life in Michigan or Ohio, but guess what? You have now created this behemoth. You have created this monstrosity of a communist China with a capitalist economy that it's one of the most powerful countries in the world. And it's pursuing its foreign policy and it's pursuing its domestic policy in a manner that is, to say the least, a problem for the United States and Europe. Now, when did it become a problem? When did Europe and America start giving a fuck about China's rise to power? Yeah, for some reason, it was when Russia invaded Ukraine, of all absurdities. I mean, China wielded tremendous power over the world for decades leading up to that, but all of a sudden, it's a problem for us. It's something we have to think about or worry about only when it's the Iron Triangle has been reversed. Only a few of you will know what that phrase means. But when instead of there being an alliance of the Russians and Americans against the Chinese, that was the original Iron Triangle. Now the triangle has been reversed. It's an alliance of China and Russia together against the United States of America. All of a sudden, whoa. Now we're not sure it's such a good idea for more than 90% of all microchips to be manufactured in China. Now, how are we going to make missiles that don't have Chinese-made electronic components? All of a sudden, so sorry, this is a long digression. But my point is, no matter how cynical you are about politics, there's absolutely no doubt, America would have continued a protectionist policy, at least in relation to Mexico and China, if America had been a democracy. There's absolutely no chance that what is called neoliberalism and what is called neoconservatism, these policies were wildly unpopular with the vast majority of voters, but they were popular with a very small number of very wealthy people who became much wealthier by being in a position to take advantage of exactly that. So, a lot of people in Detroit are now poor because of that policy, but a small number of people got rich. They were exactly the people who relocated the factories to Mexico, who relocated manufacturing to China, et cetera, et cetera. There's a small number of people who benefit from that. So, now, I mean, this is, I am cherry picking here. We can give examples where the masses would be on the wrong side. All right. Okay. So I have to come back to my major premise. But again, this is an open challenge to my audience here. You guys have been real quiet. It got real quiet in this room as I started talking. Y'all can't floss on my level. Nobody wants to tell me I'm wrong. Might be refreshing. The whole left-wing approach to homosexuality and transgender people, the whole left-wing approach to drugs, alcohol, is built around this concept of equality. As I say, in the same sense that Christendom was built around the concept of salvation. This life is just a brief veil of tears, whereas heaven lasts forever and ever. Therefore, we have to structure the government of the kingdom around being sort of the gateway to heaven for all these people. That's why your society exists, in a sense, is to inculcate Christianity to people so they can go to heaven after that. So major thing. Let's just talk about alcohol to begin with. We tolerate alcohol. There is absolutely no sense in which an alcoholic is equal to a sober person. Someone who drinks alcohol is not equal to a sober person in their ability to drive a car. They're not equal to a sober person in their ability to read, understand, and debate politics, to engage in democracy in that sense. And a drunkard is not equal to a sober person in their ability to raise children, their ability to be a good parent. And we all made a decision as a society a long time ago that we were just going to tolerate alcoholism. You can be looking at your next door neighbor and thinking that guy is an alcoholic. His wife is also an alcoholic. They're terrible parents. And your attitude has to be, there's nothing I can do about it. It's none of my business. And his kids are just going to grow up with an unspeakable, indescribable disadvantage. Because that's the principle of tolerance. It's not a principle of equality, right? The left-wing discourse right now is based on asserting the equality of a single-parent household, the equality of gay parents, the equality of transgender parents, the equality of drug addicts, every description, fentanyl addicts, cocaine addicts. It is taking this principle of equal rights, which, as I described an hour ago or something, is really linked to the unique circumstances of the English Civil War, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. It really had to do with tearing down the power of the king. That's all it meant. It meant that if the king is guilty of treason, the king has his head cut off. That was the meaning of equality, right? And now it's being applied to our lives and our system of education and our society in a way that's deeply incoherent, and it's going to have profoundly negative outcomes for people. Now, I understand the apprehension of the left. The apprehension of the left is that if we recognize inequality, it's simply going to lead to oppression, right? So I've mentioned this before. I knew a child raised in a single-parent home. In this case, he only had a father, and his father was a much older man. So it was like he was being raised by his grandfather. He had no mother. Okay. Again, we could just talk about a kid who's raised by a pair of alcoholics. The assumption is, if we depart from this equal rights paradigm, that you will take away children from their parents because they're drunk, that you will take away children from the only parent they have, being raised by a single father in that case, and you will put them in a terrible orphanage, where they are under the state's dominion, that any acknowledgement of the inequality is just going to result in a punitive, oppressive attitude, right? A kind of punishment of the people involved. But that's not the only possibility. You can recognize that people are at a disadvantage, and you can actually help them for that reason. Now, so what is equality? What is equality? Just this week, it's the inspiration of this video. I've heard left-wing people saying this discourse about equality. My parents were terrible people, and they were terrible parents, and they were terrible in ways that would be obvious to the government of Canada. There is no sense in which I had a childhood as good as my next door neighbors. And I'm thinking of a particular house where I knew the neighbors. Lots of times you don't know your neighbors. There is absolutely no sense. I was at a disadvantage compared to the kids who grew up next door to me in that house, being raised by those neighbors. Right? And we could give a list of what the obvious red flags were about my parents. I think there is an argument my parents should not have been parents at all. They shouldn't have had children, or my father shouldn't have kept having more and more children. Right? So I'm acknowledging that I'm in this disadvantaged position. But my question is not, why didn't the government lock up my parents and put them in prison as bad parents? Why didn't the government take me away and raise me in an orphanage or some of that? My question is, why did nobody try to help? And I've discussed this with my grandmother, who's now deceased, and I discussed it with just one of my aunts. I guess two aunts, another thing. Where I said to them, look, you knew who my mother was. You knew who my father was. And you knew what was going on in the 10 years leading up to my birth. You knew. Even if you knew nothing else, you should have known I was in trouble. You should have known I needed help. If you just had your eyes open and you never helped. Now, of all these people, the one I cross-examined the most was my grandmother, because during those years she was retired. She had nothing in particular to do. She played a lot of tennis. I'm just being real with you. She was a very idle, retired person. She was not rich, but she had been a dentist. And I just mentioned she made even less money because she taught dentistry at a community college. She would have made more money as a practicing dentist, but she didn't choose that. She chose to make less money teaching at a local community college. And but she had retirement savings. She didn't need to worry about money, but she wasn't a wealthy person. But she was a totally idle person who had nothing better to do than contribute to or pay attention to the education and quality of life of her grandchildren. And, in the parlance of our time, she was a horrible bitch. The only impact she had on my childhood was negative. The only impact she had on my education was making it worse. And there were actually several traumatic and violent scenes involving that same grandmother. Honestly, it's not out of privacy. I'm just not digressing to relate them. And, I have to ask that question. Again, these things, they don't exist on a chalkboard. They're not abstract principles of physics, right? Some people are being raised in a disadvantaged household and they need help. And who is going to help them? And some of you have to look in the mirror and you have to question, if not you, then who? The most dangerous delusion of our time is that the government has the solution for every problem. I just shared this story recently, I think, of a guy who was suicidal. He was very upset. He was sitting in his truck, and his mother was talking to him through the window of his truck. So he was, but he was obviously overwhelmed with emotion and sitting there behind the wheel of his truck. but he wasn't driving. He was sitting parked in his truck, and his mom was talking to him. And while his mom was trying to talk him out of suicide, she made the mistake of calling 911. And the cops showed up and shot the man and his truck 50 times. Apparently, allegedly 50 shots were fired. Now, I hate to ask you this, but what the fuck did you think the cops were going to do? The guy had a gun in the truck, and he had a gun because he was interested in shooting himself. It was not for any other purpose. But, there's this really deep abdication of responsibility where your assumption is there's a social worker who can do something, there's a psychiatrist who can do something, the cops can do something, the government with its supposedly infinite budget of taxpayers' money is going to do something. And my reply to that is not nobody is going to raise your kids but you, but nobody is going to raise our kids but us. That there's a role for other people to take responsibility and to try to help. Right now, guys, I'm not boasting, but I'm just working. It's the most humble thing I can do is talk about my own situation, one example. This isn't a boast. Okay. I can understand it now looking back. When I was a kid, I couldn't understand this at all. When I was a small child, all kinds of people thought I was a genius. All kinds of people so whatever, I'm 6 years old and they're saying, holy shit, I've never met a 6-year-old who operates on this level intellectually. And when I was 8, when I was 11, in various terms, people said, wow, this is a remarkably, astonishingly talented young man. And when that changed, when that stopped was when people started being afraid of me. It's interesting. It's actually a point later on where I'm not hearing that anymore because people are scared, which is interesting too. Topic for another video, perhaps. And again, nobody tried to help. And I was in a very bad situation with school, with education, with my teachers. I was in a very bad situation with my parents, with my family. I needed help, and I was asking everyone for help, and nobody's giving me help. Well, it's one thing. Let's just think about your own family. Let's say you have a few different cousins who are kids, cousins, nieces, nephews, this kind of thing. People who are not that close to you, but you're somehow connected to. If you have 2 different nephews who are troubled young men who have bad parents in a bad situation in school, are you motivated to reach out to and help the most brilliant, the most intelligent one? Or the one who maybe is mentally disabled? The one who maybe people say he has a learning disability. People say he's dyslexic. People say, in as much as there is any help to give, who is going to get the help? And that's partly a cultural question. That's probably. I think democracy is not based on equality, and it's not about equality, and equality is a kind of profoundly misleading and irrelevant concept to be applied to democracy. I think democracy is about helping people. And I think that you need to have a system of government that, even in its constitution, openly says that government exists in large part to help people who can't help themselves. And anyone else would suggest to you that this is some kind of ideal from the past that we need to get back to. It's not. It's a brand new ideal. That's not what our political system ever was based on or built on. You know who really needs a lawyer? People who can't afford a lawyer. You know who really needs a doctor and access to medical care? People who don't themselves have a high enough level of education to understand how the medical system works. It is the poor and the ignorant and the downtrodden who need government, who need help. It's people who have bad parents and bad teachers and a bad school, whatever. That democracy actually very integrally and centrally is about helping people. It's about an ethic and an ethos of care. And I think it's really important to recognize that ethos, that ethic, those kinds of policies have to be built on a recognition of permanent and perpetual inequality. Now, let's talk about the transgender issue as the edgiest issue of the day. All of you guys are over 20 in this audience. Can you remember what was going on with transgender politics just 5 years ago? I remember. Things have changed. Things have changed in 5 years a lot. I can remember 10 years ago. Where do you think this issue is going to be at 5 years from now? Where's it going to be 10 years from now? This is a very unstable, fast-moving area of political discourse. All right, it is not, the current situation is not sustainable. It's not going to stay the same, guys. It's not. I understand that it's based on this apprehension or assumption that any acknowledgement of inequality will result in persecution, oppression, or what have you. That people now want to stridently insist that a trans woman, let's say a single parent trans woman, so someone who's born as a man but dresses up as female, is just as good a parent and has all the same rights to being a parent as a heterosexual married couple. Let's say you have a child and you have been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Let's say you have a newborn baby and doctors have told you maybe you're going to die 6 months from now, maybe a year and a half from now. We don't know exactly, but you ain't no coming back from your cancer. You have a healthy newborn baby. You got a limited amount of time on this earth that you were going to check out. You get to write down in your will, you get to choose who is going to take over being the parent for your child. Is a single parent family equal to a two-parent family? Is a family where the father is an alcoholic equal to a family that's committed to total sobriety? Is a transgender single parent or two transgender people living together, are they equal? Is that really what you believe? Is that really the decision you're going to make? I'm the first person to concede. You may know an extraordinary trans person who would be a great parent. You may know one, And what's even worse, let's say you have two brothers, and for whatever reason, this is the choice you're making. And one of your brothers is a heterosexual alcoholic, and one of your brothers is a completely sober trans person. And you say, you know what? I'm going to leave my kid to be raised by a trans person because I don't want him being raised by an alcoholic. That may be your actual stream. Maybe your best option is a trans person out of the selection of people you have to choose who will adopt your own child. Maybe it's possible. But what if our reason for acknowledging the inequality is because we actually want to help? What if we recognize that a child being raised in this family has disadvantages compared to being a child raised in this family because we want to do something positive about it to actually fucking help that child? And the unasked and unanswered question here, of course, is religion. Do you really believe a child being raised by the Taliban is equal to a child being given a modern secular education? Do you really believe a child being raised by Scientologists is equal to someone with a modern secular education? Do you really believe a child being raised by Mormons, any other religion, mainstream or fringe or cultic? Do you really think a child being raised with the superstitions of Hinduism is equal to a child being raised without superstition? No, you don't believe that. And that's why you would not give your own child up for adoption to be raised by a family of people who were members of any of these crazy cults. And in fact, this matters so much that you would probably prefer your child to be raised by a pair of highly eccentric transgender people than have them be raised by Mormons or fundamentalist Muslims. Just that one issue. If you know two trans people who are atheists, who are free thinkers, that alone might make that difference. Okay? So, the future of democracy relies on people like myself being at the podium and on the microphone when government is debating Myanmar, Cambodia. I mean, I know it's a stretch. I could even say this about, say, First Nations languages. which is not in my top 10 areas of expertise, but I have this background in Korean Ojibwe. I don't have a lot of competition. I probably should be on the microphone on some other issues like that too. First Nations, language education, endangered language bowls. We could list off some other issues. I have competition with politics of China. You know what I mean? Again, any of these things I could have remained a specialist in and developed my expertise over years. I'm very glad I didn't. There are all these different things where you can say, yeah, you know what? Down on Parliament Hill, you should have a voice on this. Whose voice matters when you're talking about Prozac? When you're talking about the advantages and disadvantages of having a population that is on mind-altering psych meds to a massive extent, who is going to raise? No, I have absolutely no qualifications in that field. I just happen to be right about it. Whereas a whole lot of people with university qualifications who may or may not be corrupt or in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry, their opinion doesn't matter. Who gets to have a voice and who gets to make those decisions? All right. The only way forward is to have a dynamic and profound recognition of the inequality, that not everyone's opinion matters equally about Prozac. Not everyone's opinion matters equally about Myanmar. And then to devise a way in which we can take care of each other, in which, it's not based on privacy either, in which we can really be obtrusively involved in one another's lives, right? And thus, together with the cacophony that comes out of that, we can really make progress. Why do people want to believe in equality in its 21st century sense? Why do people want to believe in equal rights, human rights, in its 21st century sense? Not the sense from 300 years ago, English Civil War, American Revolution. I will tell you why. It's because equal rights and human rights is a doctrine of saying, it's not my problem. I don't have to do anything about it. I don't have to think anything about it. The doctrine of equal rights we have today is the direct descendant of the justification of segregation in the American South, whereby white people would just have their own separate hospitals and their own separate schools. And when you ask them, what about the Black people? What about the Hispanic people? They would say back, they have their own way of doing things. Separate but equal is the grandfather of the politically woke leftist notion of equality that we have today. And it really does come down to the idea that whatever the fuck you're doing, I'm not responsible for. I'm not responsible for the fact that our whole society is becoming step by step dominated by drug addicts because each and every one of those drug addicts is enjoying their civil rights and their equal rights, and they're entitled to all of these benefits and support the same as everyone else. And that I am not going to question how you are raising your child or how that school is educating people, even if Muslim fundamentalists set up a separate school board, Christian and Jewish fundamentalists set up a separate school board, even if we are all step by step moving toward a deeply fragmented society of rival religions, rival cult ideologies, and mass rampant drug addiction.